Before there was a temple, before there was a king, before Jerusalem was anything more than a name no one had yet spoken, there was a desert, a people, and a promise that seemed impossible to keep. They had nothing, or almost nothing. 400 years of slavery had taken everything from them: their land, their language of freedom, their sense of what they deserved. What remained were hands, calloused, cracked, worn down to the bone by Egyptian sun and Egyptian brick. Hands that knew how to endure, but had never been asked to create anything beautiful. And then on a mountain wrapped in thunder and fire, God spoke to Moses, not with a general direction, not with a rough idea, with exact measurements, exact materials, exact proportions. Build me a dwelling place, a sanctuary, a house where heaven touches earth. The instructions were so precise, so technically demanding, that even a master craftsman with a full workshop and unlimited resources would have paused. Golden lampstands hammered from a single block. Curtains woven with colors that cost more than silver. Foundation sockets of pure solid silver, each one weighing 35 kilograms, 100 of them, aligned perfectly in desert sand. And the ones being asked to build all of this? Former slaves. Men whose entire professional history was mud and straw. Women who had never woven anything finer than what their survival required. This is not just the story of the building. This is the story of what happens when the divine asks the broken to do the impossible and the broken say yes.
I surrender.
This channel exists for moments like this. For the stories inside the story, the ones hiding beneath the familiar verses, in the dust and the fire and the human hands that held it all together. We read slowly here. We look closely. Because when you look closely at Scripture, you don't find less mystery. You find more. If that's the kind of journey you're looking for, you're already in the right place. Before a single tool was lifted, before the first fire was lit, before one plank of acacia wood was cut from its twisted trunk, there was the moment Moses came down from the mountain. And everything changed. He had been up there for 40 days. 40 days inside a cloud that burned like a furnace, in the presence of something so far beyond human comprehension that when he finally descended, his face was literally glowing and he didn't even know it. The people who saw him coming down the slope stepped back, not out of disrespect, out of instinct. Because there are moments when a man carries something with him that you can feel before he speaks. This was one of those moments. Moses gathered the entire assembly of Israel. Every man, every woman, every child old enough to understand. And he began to speak not with his own words, but with the words given to him on the mountain. A blueprint, a design, a divine architectural vision for something that had never existed before in the history of the world. A sanctuary, a dwelling place, a house for God not fixed in stone on a hilltop, but portable, mobile, designed to move with the wandering people through a wilderness that had no end in sight. The concept alone was staggering. Every culture in the ancient world built their gods into immovable temples. The Egyptians carved their deities into mountains. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats that touched the sky, A god was something permanent, rooted, fixed to a geography. A god stayed where you put him. But this god was different. This god said, I will come to where you are. Build me something I can travel with. And the specifications he gave were not suggestions. They were not approximations.
It is done.
They were exact.
The word
Precise to a
takes
degree
form.
that assumed a level of craftsmanship the people of Israel had never been asked to demonstrate. Gold pure, refined, worked into shapes of impossible delicacy. Silver cast into foundation sockets of exact weight. Bronze hammered into utensils and altar fittings. Acacia wood cut, planed, and overlaid with gold until the rough became radiant. Fabrics of blue, purple, and crimson. Curtains woven with images of angelic beings. Gemstones cut and engraved with the names of tribes. Moses looked out at the crowd as he described all of this. And what did he see? People who had spent their entire lives making bricks. Men with backs spent from decades of labor under Egyptian overseers. Women whose hands knew coarse linen and little else. A generation that had grown up inside a system designed to keep them useful but never skilled, productive but never creative, strong but never precise. This was the workforce. This was what was available. And here is where the story reveals something that no management book, no leadership seminar, no modern theory of organizational transformation has ever quite captured. The gap between what was needed and what existed, between the skill required and a skill available, was not going to be closed by training alone.
Maybe we can turn it.
It was not going to be solved by motivation speeches or careful scheduling. Something else was needed. Something from outside the human system entirely. But before that something arrived, Moses made a request that would define the entire project.
Come,
He did not command.
let us walk
He did
together.
not demand. He did not issue a labor quota the way Pharaoh had issued brick quotas. He asked, "Whoever is of a willing heart, let them bring an offering. Gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and crimson yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins, acacia wood, oil, spices, gemstones, whatever you have, whatever you carried out of Egypt on that desperate night when the cries of an entire nation rose to heaven and the doors of a 400-year prison finally swung open. Bring it. Not because you must,
I am ready.
because you want to." And what
God
happened
has
next
been
was one of
kind.
the most astonishing acts of collective generosity in all of Scripture. They brought everything. Men and women, like morning after morning, came carrying what they had. Earrings pulled from their own ears. Bracelets removed from their own wrists. Gold rings, silver clasps, bronze mirrors that Egyptian women had pressed into their hands on the night of Passover, desperate for the Hebrew people to simply leave and take the terror of the plagues with them. They brought so much that Moses eventually had to send a message through the camp.
Stop the
Stopped.
giving. It is sufficient.
We have more than
and
enough.
more than enough.
The craftsmen say they cannot use everything you are bringing. In the history of fundraising for construction projects, there may be no moment quite like this one. A people with almost nothing legally, economically, socially gave until they were told to stop. The material problem was solved.
Our needs are met.
The resource question was answered. But the skill question remained wide open. And it was about to be answered in a way that no one in the camp could have anticipated, least of all the man whose name God was about to call. There is a moment in every impossible project when someone has to step forward and say, "I know how to do this." That moment came in the form of a man named Bezalel. Not a priest. Not a military commander. Not one of the 70 elders who sat at Moses' council table. Bezalel was an artisan, or at least, he had been something close to one. The son of Uri, the grandson of Hur, from the tribe of Judah. Beyond that, Scripture tells us almost nothing about his life before this moment. No dramatic backstory. No years of legendary craftsmanship. No reputation that preceded him through the camp. Just a name. And then a calling. Exodus 31 records the moment with striking directness. God speaks to Moses and says, "I have called Bezalel by name. I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship." Read that slowly, because something extraordinary is happening here. This is the first time in all of Scripture that a specific individual is described as being filled with the Spirit of God. Not a prophet, not a king, not a priest standing before the altar. A craftsman, a worker with his hands. The first person in the entire biblical narrative to receive this particular divine endowment, and it was given not for preaching, not for leading armies, not for working miracles, but for working with gold, silver, bronze, wood, and stone. There is a theology hidden in this moment that most people walk right past. The sacred and the skillful are not separate categories. The divine and the practical are not opposites. God did not consider it beneath His Spirit to fill a man for the purpose of cutting gemstones and weaving fabric. The work of the hands done with precision, done with care, done in service of something greater than oneself was considered holy enough to require supernatural endowment. Think about what Bezalel was being asked to do. He had grown up in Egypt, in the world's most advanced civilization of the ancient era. He had almost certainly watched Egyptian master craftsmen at work, men who had inherited generations of refined technique in metalworking, wood carving, textile production, and gemstone cutting. He had seen what skilled hands could produce. He understood, at least observationally, what excellence looked like. But observation is not mastery. Watching a goldsmith pour molten metal into a mold does not make you a goldsmith. And what Bezalel was being asked to produce was not merely competent workmanship. It was perfection. Divinely specified, heavenly patterned perfection replicated in the middle of a desert with improvised tools and a workforce of former slaves. The gap between what he had and what was required was enormous. And then the Spirit came. Scripture describes the endowment in 4 distinct dimensions. Wisdom, the ability to apply knowledge correctly, to make the right decision in the moment when materials and conditions and vision all converge. Understanding, the capacity to see how the pieces fit together, how the design becomes a structure, how the vision becomes a reality. Knowledge, the specific, technical, practical information needed to work each material correctly, and workmanship, the physical skill, the hand-eye coordination, the muscle memory, the intuitive feel for when metal is at the right temperature, when wood is at the right grain, when a gemstone is at the right angle. All four given at once, not gradually, through years of apprenticeship, not partially, through natural gifting, completely, supernaturally, immediately. But Bezalel was not alone.
It is good.
God
and it is
named a
blessed.
second man alongside him,
Thank you, my
Aholiab,
Lord.
son of Ahisamach, from the tribe of Dan. And this pairing carries a meaning that the original audience would have felt immediately, even if modern readers tend to overlook it. Judah and Dan. Judah was the tribe of kings, the tribe of prestige, of prominence, of prophetic destiny. When Israel gathered, Judah led the procession. When the tribes were ranked, Judah stood at the top. Bezalel carried the weight of that heritage in his name. Dan was one of the smallest tribes, geographically peripheral, historically unremarkable, a tribe that would later become associated with instability and wandering. Aholiab carried none of Bezalel's social capital. He came from the margins, and God deliberately chose both of them, placed them side by side, made them partners in the most sacred construction project in Israel's history.
Hold it.
The Tabernacle was not going to be built by the prestigious alone. It was not going to be a monument to one tribe's greatness, one family's legacy, one man's genius. From the very beginning, God built diversity into the foundation of his dwelling place, not as an afterthought, but as a design principle. There is something quietly radical about this. But the calling of two men, however supernaturally gifted, was still not enough. A sanctuary of this scale required hundreds of workers. And so Exodus 35 records something that is easy to read past but impossible to overstate.
steady,
God
brother.
placed
Feel
in the
the heat.
hearts of
I am
Bezalel
fine.
and
That's it.
Aholiab
Let
the
the chisel
ability
guide
to
you. See the
teach,
grain? Yes. Push
not
through. You
just
have
to
the
do,
gift.
to teach. They became, in the middle of the Sinai desert, the founders of what may be the most unlikely vocational school in human history. Men who had spent their lives making bricks
Keep
sat
your
down
grip
with a
light
master craftsman
and the
and
angle
learned to hold a
precise,
chisel
like this.
differently.
Now,
Women
you
who
hold
had
it.
never woven anything more
2,
complex
3,
than basic cloth
4,
began to
5,
learn the
6,
mathematics of pattern
7,
weaving, how to
8,
plan a
9.
design across hundreds of threads so that an angelic figure appears in exactly the right place without a single mistake. The school had no building, no textbooks, no graduation ceremony.
The design is precise,
It had a
but the alignment
deadline,
here. Adjust
a
the angle.
divine
This point
blueprint,
requires absolute
and two
symmetry to
men
hold the
filled
power.
with
Yes, you are
something
right.
that
It
could
must
not be
exact.
explained by background or biography. And it worked. Week by week, rough hands became more precise. Eyes that had only ever measured brick molds began to measure gold with accuracy. The camp that Moses had looked out at and seen only former slaves was quietly becoming something else entirely.
Work is finished.
A nation
It
of
is
craftsmen,
perfect. Truly a blessing.
built from nothing. In the middle of nowhere, there is a temperature that changes everything. 1064 degrees Celsius. That is the precise point at which gold stops being solid and becomes liquid fluid, moldable, capable of being poured into shapes that would be impossible to achieve any other way. Below that temperature, Gold is hard and unyielding. Above it, gold becomes something close to miraculous. The tabernacle required enormous quantities of gold worked to that liquid state. The lampstand alone, a single piece, hammered from one unbroken talent of pure gold, weighing 35 kilograms, had to be brought to that temperature and held there long enough for skilled hands to shape it without seams, without welds, without the mercy of being able to start over if something went wrong. And they had to achieve this in the middle of the Sinai desert. No coal mines, no forests of hardwood, no industrial furnaces built from fireproof brick. Just sand, sun, and a people who would never run a metalworking operation of any kind, let alone one, demanding temperatures that would not be reliably achievable again in human history until the invention of the industrial blast furnace, thousands of years later. So how did they do it? The answer begins with a tree that nobody wanted. The acacia tree is not beautiful. It grows in twisted, irregular shapes, no two alike, none of them straight, most of them covered in sharp thorns that make even approaching them unpleasant. Egyptian craftsmen preferred cedar. Carpenters throughout the ancient world coveted the tall, straight, fragrant timbers of Lebanon. Acacia was the wood of desperation, the material you used when nothing better was available. But acacia had a secret. When properly harvested and converted into charcoal, slowly burned in a low oxygen environment until only the carbon structure remained, acacia wood produces a fuel of extraordinary density and heat output. Acacia charcoal burns hotter, longer, and more consistently than almost any other wood-based fuel available in that region. It was, in a landscape that offered almost nothing, the one thing that could make the metal work possible. The Israelites almost certainly learned this or something close to it from the Egyptians. 400 years of proximity to the ancient world's most advanced civilization had left its mark. Egyptian metalworkers were masters of their craft, and the Hebrews who had lived and labored among them would have absorbed at minimum the observational knowledge of how fires were built, how metals behaved, how temperatures were sustained. But knowing something and doing it are separated by an enormous distance. Imagine the scene. Improvised furnaces built from desert clay, shaped by hand, dried in the sun, reinforced with whatever materials were available. Leather bellows worked by foot, pumping air in rhythmic bursts into the base of the fire, forcing oxygen into the coals and driving the temperature higher. Dozens of men rotating through the work in shifts because no human body could sustain the kind of heat exposure for long without rest. The desert itself was already brutal. 40 degrees Celsius in the shade, the kind of heat that makes simply existing feel like work. Now add to that the radiant output of a furnace burning at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees, positioned just meters away from where men were standing, working, sweating, breathing air that was itself scorched. The skin cracked, not gradually, quickly. The combination of extreme dry heat from the desert and the searing intensity of the furnace pulled moisture from the body faster than it could be replaced. Water was carried in leather pouches, always warm, never cold, never quite enough. There was no ice. There was no shade that offered real relief from both the sun and the fire simultaneously. Burns were not occasional accidents. They were part of the work. Molten metal moves unpredictably.
Finish.
It spatters when it contacts a surface with any moisture at all. It runs along unexpected paths. Tools heated to working temperature could blister skin through thick cloth in seconds. The protection available to these workers, rough fabric, perhaps damp and cloth wrapped around the hands and forearms, was minimal by any standard. What they relied on, more than any physical protection, was attention. Absolute, constant, unblinking attention to what the metal was doing at every moment. And through all of this, through the heat and the burns and the exhaustion and the water that was never cold enough, they had to produce work of extraordinary precision. Consider the golden lampstand. Exodus 25 describes it in detail that makes any craftsman's hands nervous just reading it. A central shaft. 6 branches extending from it, 3 on each side, each one curving upward in exact proportions. Decorative cups shaped like almond blossoms, each with a distinct calyx and petal. The entire structure, shaft, branches, blossoms, cups, base, hammered from a single piece of gold. Not assembled, not soldered together. One piece. There was no blueprint in the modern sense. No technical drawing to consult. Moses carried the design in his memory, a pattern shown to him on the mountain that he had to describe in words to man, who would then have to translate those words into physical reality, in metal, at temperatures that gave them almost no margin for reflection. If the metal cooled too quickly, the shaping was lost. If it stayed too hot for too long, the structure became unstable. The window of workability was narrow and unforgiving. One mistake, one moment of inattention, one miscalculation of temperature, one hammer blow at the wrong angle, and 35 kilograms of irreplaceable gold would have to be melted down and started again from scratch. They did not start again from scratch. The lampstand was completed. The altar fittings were completed. The gold overlay for the ark, the table, the framework, all of it completed. Hundreds of kilograms of metal worked to divine specification, in conditions that should have made precision impossible, by men who had never done anything remotely like this before. There is a word for what happened in those desert furnaces. The word is not engineering, though engineering was involved. The word is not craftsmanship, though craftsmanship was evident in every finished piece. The word is faithfulness. The stubborn, costly, unglamorous faithfulness of people who showed up to an impossible task day after day, in unbearable heat, with burned hands and parched throats, and refused to produce anything less than what had been asked of them, because the one who had asked was worth it. A building that cannot have foundations, walls that cannot be buried in the ground, a structure that must stand firm against desert windstorms, and then, when the cloud moves, be taken apart completely in a matter of hours, loaded onto carts, carried across miles of shifting sand, and reassembled somewhere else. Perfectly. Every time. For 40 years. This was not a construction problem. It was an engineering paradox. Every principle of ancient architecture assumed permanence. You built deep into the ground, precisely because the ground was the only thing that could hold a structure upright against the forces working to bring it down. The Egyptians built temples that weighed millions of tons specifically so that nothing could move them. Stability came from mass, from depth, from roots sunk into the earth that time itself could not dislodge. The tabernacle could have none of that. And so Bezalel and his team of newly trained craftsmen faced a structural challenge that had no precedent in the ancient world and precious few equivalents, even in the modern one.
Just a little
How do you build something that is simultaneously strong enough to stand and light enough to move? How do you create rigidity without permanence? How do you make walls that hold against the wind but surrender to the cloud? The solution they arrived at was, in a word, elegant. It began at the bottom. Not with concrete, not with stone, not with anything driven into the earth, but with silver. Pure, cast, heavy silver. 100 foundation sockets, each one receiving a single plank of acacia wood through precisely fitted tenon joints cut into the base of every board. Each socket weighed 1 talent, 35 kilograms of solid silver, sitting on the surface of the desert's sand, held in place by nothing but its own weight and the weight of everything stacked above it. Gravity is architecture. Mass is foundation. The structure did not grip the earth. It simply pressed into it, heavily enough that the earth had no choice but to hold it. The planks themselves, 48 of them for the main walls, were cut from acacia wood. And here again, the choice of material reveals a logic that goes deeper than the obvious. Acacia is dense. Dense wood is heavy wood. But acacia is also extraordinarily resistant to warping, unlike softer woods that expand and contract dramatically with changes in temperature and humidity. Acacia maintains its shape under conditions that would destroy lesser timber. In a desert environment where temperatures could swing from scorching midday heat to cold desert nights, and where sandstorms could deposit moisture on surfaces that had been completely dry hours before, this resistance to warping was not a luxury. It was a structural necessity. A plank that warped would no longer fit its silver socket precisely. A plank that no longer fit its socket precisely would compromise the entire wall. And a wall that moved even slightly would pull against the system of crossbars holding everything together, and the whole structure would begin to shift. Every plank had to remain exactly what it was, under every condition, for decades. Acacia did not disappoint. Each plank was overlaid entirely in gold, not as decoration, though the visual effect was breathtaking, but as protection. Gold does not rust. Gold does not corrode. Gold does not react with the minerals in desert sand or the salt in desert air. The wood beneath it was sealed inside a casing of the most chemically stable metal available to them, protected from moisture, from insects, from the slow oxidation that would eventually destroy any exposed timber. The wood was hidden. The gold was visible. But the wood was doing the structural work, and the gold was making sure the wood could keep doing it indefinitely. Above the silver sockets and the golden planks, a system of crossbars, 5 horizontal bars per wall, also of acacia and also overlaid with gold, ran through golden rings attached to each plank, locking the entire wall into a single rigid panel. The metal crossbar ran the full length of the wall, through the interior of the planks themselves, providing a continuous tensile element that prevented the structure from folding under lateral pressure. This is, in principle, not entirely different from what modern engineers call a stress skin panel, a structural system where the outer surface itself carries load, distributing force across a wide area rather than concentrating it at a few points. The tabernacle walls functioned as a system, not as a collection of individual planks. Remove one plank and the system weakened. Keep all of them together and a system was stronger than any single element within it.
Pull.
When the walls were fully assembled and the
Over the top.
crossbars
Secure
locked
it.
in place,
Done.
the entire structure was covered with 4 successive layers of material, each one serving a different purpose. The innermost layer, the one that would be visible to anyone standing inside the sanctuary, was fine twisted linen embroidered with figures of cherubim in blue, purple, and crimson thread. This was the layer of glory, the one designed to make the interior look like something other than a tent in a desert. Above that, a covering of goat hair, insulating, weather-resistant, naturally water-repellent. Above that, ram skins dyed red. And finally, on the outside, a layer of durable animal skin, likely from sea creatures, possibly dolphins or dugongs, a material known for its exceptional resistance to salt, sun, and abrasion. From the outside, the tabernacle looked like what it was: a large tent, weathered, practical, unremarkable. A traveler passing at a distance would have seen nothing to pause for. From the inside, standing beneath the cherubim that seemed to float above you in the lamplight, surrounded by walls of gold that reflected every flame from the golden lampstand, it looked like nothing that had ever existed on earth. Because nothing like it had ever existed on earth. And then, when the cloud lifted, when God's visible presence rose from above the sanctuary and began to move, all of it came down. The crossbars were removed. The planks were lifted from their silver sockets. The curtains were folded, the coverings rolled, the furnishings wrapped in protective cloth and loaded onto the shoulders of Levites assigned specifically to carry each piece. The entire operation had to be completed quickly enough to follow the cloud, which did not wait for slow workers. And when the cloud stopped hours later, days later, sometimes months later, it all went back up. Plank by plank, socket by socket, crossbar by crossbar. The same structure, in the same configuration, with the same precision. For 40 years, across hundreds of encampments, through sand and wind and rain and the ordinary chaos of a nation on the move, the tabernacle went up and came down, again and again. And every time it went up, it stood. Not because the engineering was lucky, because the engineering was right. If this is the first time you've found this channel and something in what you just heard made you want to go back and read Exodus with completely different eyes, that's exactly what this community is here for. We'd love to have you with us. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are things that money cannot easily buy, and in the ancient world, color was one of them. Not all color. Brown was everywhere in the earth, in the wood, in the cloth that ordinary people wore through their ordinary lives. Gray was everywhere. Undyed linen, the color of raw fiber, the color of survival. These were the colors of the common world. Available, affordable, unremarkable. But blue is specific, deep, luminous blue that did not fade in sunlight or wash out in rain, that was something else entirely. That was the color of kings, the color of power, the color that Phoenician traders carried across the Mediterranean in sealed containers, selling it by weight, in quantities that even wealthy merchants could barely afford. And the interior of the tabernacle was covered in it. Blue and purple and crimson. Three colors that together represented the apex of what the ancient world considered visually magnificent, woven not just into decorative borders but into the very fabric of the curtains themselves, in intricate patterns of cherubim that required a level of mathematical planning most modern weavers would find demanding even with the benefit of computers and printed patterns. To understand what this cost not in money, but in effort, in logistics, in the specific kind of knowledge required to produce it, you have to understand where these colors came from. The blue came from a creature called the murex snail, a sea mollusk, found primarily along the Phoenician coastline, hundreds of miles from the Sinai Desert. Each snail contained, in a small gland beneath its shell, a tiny quantity of a fluid that, when exposed to air and sunlight through a precise process of extraction and oxidation, produced a blue of incomparable depth and permanence. The color did not fade. It did not wash out. Centuries after a garment was made with murex blue, the color remained as vivid as the day it was applied. But the quantity of fluid in each snail was minuscule. To dye a single garment, not a curtain, not a wall hanging, a single garment required thousands of crushed snails. The smell of the process was, by all historical accounts, overwhelming. Factories that produced this dye were built at the edges of cities, downwind of everything else, because the stench of thousands of rotting shellfish was incompatible with normal urban life. Purple came from the same family of creatures, a slightly different species, a slightly different chemical process, an equally demanding extraction. Crimson came from an entirely different source, a small insect called the kermes, or in the Hebrew tradition, the tola worm, harvested at a specific moment in its life cycle, tried, and crushed to release a red pigment of extraordinary intensity and stability. None of these things existed in the Sinai Desert. And yet Exodus 35 tells us that when Moses made his request, when he asked the people to bring whatever they had carried out of Egypt, among the offerings that came forward were blue, purple, and crimson yarn, spun already, dyed already, ready to be woven. They had brought it with them from Egypt. On the night of Passover, in the desperate hours when the firstborn of Egypt lay dead and Pharaoh was calling for Moses in the darkness, the Egyptian people had pressed into Hebrew hands everything they could find: gold, silver, fine linen, garments, jewelry, whatever it took to make this terrifying people leave. And among those gifts, carried out of the most advanced textile-producing civilization of the ancient world, were threads dyed with colors that had cost fortunes to produce. The women of Israel had carried these threads across the Red Sea, through weeks of desert travel, to this moment. And now they sat down at their looms. Exodus 35 is careful to name them. Not by name, their individual names are not recorded, but by character. The women who were skilled at heart. The phrase in the original Hebrew suggests something more than technical competence. It implies a kind of devotion that expressed itself through craft hands guided not just by training but by something deeper, a willingness to give their best work to the best possible purpose. They spun the yarn themselves, twisted the fine linen threads to the exact tightness required for the weave, and then they began to work the patterned cherubim, angelic figures, woven directly into the fabric itself rather than embroidered on top of it afterward. This distinction matters more than it might seem. Embroidery adds thread on top of an existing surface. It is demanding, but it is correctable. A mistake can be removed and redone without destroying the underlying cloth. But weaving a figure into the fabric as it is being made requires the pattern to exist entirely in the mind of the weaver before a single thread is placed. Every cherubim had to be planned, its dimensions, its position within the panel, its relationship to the cherubim beside it before the loom was warped. Before the shuttle was thrown for the first time, a mistake discovered halfway through a panel meant the entire panel had to be unwoven and started again. There were no printed patterns, no graph paper, no way to step back and look at a digital preview of the finished design. There was only the thread, the loom, the memory, and the discipline to execute what had been planned row after painstaking row until the figure emerged from the weave exactly as it had been conceived. 10 curtains made up the innermost layer of the tabernacle. Each curtain was 4 cubits wide and 28 cubits long, roughly 2 meters by 14 meters. They were joined in sets of 5, and the 2 sets were connected by 50 gold clasps running along a border of blue loops. When the panels were hung and the clasps were fastened, the seams disappeared. The ceiling became continuous. The cherubim appeared to float above the interior space in an unbroken procession of color and form. The effect, in the flickering light of the golden lampstand, would have been unlike anything any human being in the ancient world had ever seen inside an enclosed space. Not a throne room, not a palace, not a temple carved from stone with painted images fixed to immovable walls. Something alive, something that moved with the light, something that made the air inside the tent feel different from the air outside it. By the time the last clasp was fastened and the last curtain hung, the people who had built it understood something about beauty that most of the ancient world had missed entirely. Beauty was not reserved for the powerful. It was not the exclusive property of kings and pharaohs. It could be made painstakingly, sacrificially, thread by women whose names were never recorded, working at looms in the desert, giving their most careful work to the one they could not see but somehow, unmistakably, knew was watching. There was a rope tied around his ankle. That is what some ancient traditions say. That before the high priest entered the most holy place on the Day of Atonement, the one day each year when a single human being was permitted to pass beyond the inner veil and stand in the concentrated presence of God, a rope was tied around his ankle, so that if the bells stopped ringing, if the silence came, if something went wrong inside that sealed and sacred space, the body could be retrieved without anyone else having to cross the threshold that had just proven fatal. The Bible does not confirm the rope, but the Bible does confirm the bells. And the fact that the rope tradition existed at all, that someone, at some point, considered it a realistic enough possibility to prepare, for it tells you something important about what it meant to enter that room. It was not a ceremony. It was not a performance. It was not a ritual in the modern sense of something familiar and safe, repeated so many that it had become comfortable. It was, every single time, a genuine encounter with holiness so concentrated, so complete, so utterly beyond the human capacity to contain, that the wrong preparation, a single detail out of place, a single requirement unmet, could end a man's life before he had taken 3 steps inside. And the garments the high priest wore were not designed to make him look impressive. They were designed to keep him alive. Exodus 28 describes them in extraordinary detail, a detail that goes far beyond what would be necessary if these were merely ceremonial robes. Every element had a function. Every function was connected to the larger purpose of making it possible for a human being to stand, however briefly, in a place where human beings were not naturally equipped to stand. The foundation of the priestly vestments was the linen tunic, white, pure, covering the body completely. Above that, the blue robe, woven entirely from a single color, hem to collar. Above that, the ephod, a garment of gold, blue, purple, and crimson thread, worn over the shoulders, carrying on each shoulder strap an onyx stone engraved with the names of 6 tribes of Israel. He did not enter alone. He carried the entire nation on his shoulders, literally, in stone. And across his chest the breastpiece. Exodus 28 calls it the breastpiece of judgment. A folded panel of fabric, a span square when folded, set with 12 gemstones in 4 rows of 3. Each stone was different: sardius, topaz, carbuncle, emerald, sapphire, diamond, jacinth, agate, amethyst, beryl, onyx, jasper. Each one engraved with the name of a tribe of Israel, set in a gold mounting, connected by chains of pure gold to the ephod at the shoulders and by blue cord to the waistband below. The craftsmanship required to produce this single piece was, by itself, extraordinary. Gemstone engraving in the ancient world was not done with modern rotary tools or laser cutters. It was done with abrasive powders, emery, corundum, fine sand applied through the tip of a copper or bronze drill, rotated by hand with a bow drill, for hours, for days, grinding letter by letter into stones harder than the tools themselves. A single slip, a single moment of inattention, and the stone cracked. And a cracked stone could not be repaired. It could not be sent back to the supplier for a replacement. There was no supplier. There was only what they had brought out of Egypt, and what they had been given, and the irreplaceable nature of every piece. Each letter had to be cut with the knowledge that there was no margin for error. 12 stones, 12 names, each one a tribe, each one a family, each one a promise that stretched back to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, who had wrestled with God through the night and received the new name with the dawn. The high priest carried all of them into the presence of God, not as an abstraction, in stone, on his chest, over his heart. But it was the hem of the blue robe that carried the detail most impossible to ignore. Exodus 28 instructs that along the entire bottom edge of the robe, alternating, one after another, golden bells and pomegranates of blue, purple, and crimson thread should be attached. The pomegranates were purely tactile and visual, weighted fabric shapes that swayed with each step. The bells were something else. They rang with every movement. Every step the high priest took inside the sanctuary, every turn, every descent to his knees, the bells spoke. A continuous, delicate sound, passing through the veil, audible to the other priests waiting outside. A sound that meant, he is still moving. He is still alive. The encounter is still happening. And then Exodus 28:35 states the purpose with a directness that leaves no room for comfortable interpretation. The bells were there so that he would not die, not so that the ceremony would be dignified, not so that the worship would be beautiful, though it was, so that he would not die.
I see it.
The silence of the bells was not a pause in the music. It was a signal. It was the sound of something going wrong in a place where nothing could be done from the outside.
Don't look at it.
It was the moment
Just back
when every
away.
priest waiting beyond the veil would have understood, without being told, that the rope, if the rope existed, was about to be needed. What could go wrong? The text does not specify. But the broader narrative of Scripture is not silent on the subject. Leviticus 10 records the deaths of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's own sons, priests by birth and training, who offered unauthorized fire before the Lord and were consumed immediately. No warning, no second chance. The fire of God's holiness, which warmed and guided and protected when approached correctly, was the same fire that destroyed when approached carelessly. Proximity to holiness was not inherently safe. It was inherently demanding. It required everything to be right: the garments, the incense, the blood of the sacrifice, the posture of the heart, because what was being approached was not a symbol of God. It was God, present, real, concentrated in that space in a way that made the air itself different. And yet year after year the high priest dressed himself in those garments, checked every bell, adjusted every stone, and walked through the veil. Not because he was unafraid. Almost certainly he was afraid. But because someone had to go. Because the nation needed what only that moment could provide: the annual assurance that the way between humanity and God had not been permanently closed, that forgiveness was still possible, that the covenant was still alive. He walked in carrying the names of his people on his chest and the sound of his own continued existence on his hem.
He lives.
And every year, when the bells began to ring again on the other side of the veil, growing louder as he approached the exit, stepping back through into the world where human lungs could breathe normally and human hearts could slow their pace every year, that sound was a kind of resurrection. He had gone in, and he had come back. It was enough. For one more year, it was enough. If something in this story is making you want to go back and read Exodus slowly from the beginning, with new eyes, that is exactly the right instinct. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There is much more where this came from. There is a moment in Exodus 40 that is easy to read past. Moses has finished. Everything is done. The planks are standing in their silver sockets. The curtains are hung. The lampstand is burning. The incense is rising. The ark is in its place behind the inner veil. Every measurement correct. Every material accounted for. Every instruction followed, down to the last golden bell on the hem of the last garment. Moses stands in the doorway and looks at what a nation of former slaves has built. And then Exodus 39:43 records something quietly remarkable. It says that Moses looked at all the work and saw that they had done it just as the Lord had commanded.
The Lord bless you and keep
Every
you. The Lord make
detail,
his face shine upon you and be
every
gracious to you.
dimension,
The Lord lift up
every
his countenance upon you
requirement.
and give you peace.
And he blessed them. Not the building, the people. Because the building was never really the point. The building was the evidence. The evidence that broken people, given a purpose worthy of their best effort, will find within themselves or receive from beyond themselves exactly what the purpose requires. The evidence that the hands that made bricks can learn to pour gold. That the women who survived Egypt can weave angels into linen. That a man with no formal training can be filled with something that makes him capable of things no training could produce. The tabernacle was not a monument to human achievement. It was a monument to what happens when the human and the divine decide to work on the same project. And then the cloud came. Not gradually, not partially. A cloud so thick, so heavy, so completely present that it filled the entire structure. And Moses, who had stood inside a burning mountain, who had spoken with God face to face as a man speaks with his friend, could not enter. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This was the answer to every question that construction had raised.
The answer to suffering.
Every burned hand, every sleepless night beside a furnace, every thread carefully counted, every stone carefully cut. This was what it had been for. Not admiration, not religious duty, not the satisfaction of a project completed. Presence, actual, tangible, overwhelming divine presence, descending into the thing they had made with their hands, making it something their hands alone could never have made it. A dwelling place, not a symbol of one, not a representation of one. A place where God actually came to live among his people, moving when they moved, stopping when they stopped, present in the ordinary geography of their wandering lives. And, from that day forward, whenever the cloud lifted, whenever the visible presence of God rose from above the tabernacle and began to move across the desert sky, the entire nation of Israel broke camp and followed. They did not debate. They did not vote. They did not consult their own schedules or preferences or comfort. They followed the cloud. And when the cloud stopped, they stopped. And they built it again. 40 years. Hundreds of encampments. Desert heat and mountain cold, and a long, disorienting sameness of wilderness that has no landmarks and no obvious end.
Just a little
Through
further.
all of it, the tabernacle went up and came down, and every time it went up, the glory returned. The same glory, in the same place, among the same people. There is something in that faithfulness, God's faithfulness, sustained across 4 decades of wandering, never withdrawing, never relocating to somewhere more convenient or more deserving, that deserves to be sat with quietly for a moment. He did not choose a palace. He chose a tent. He did not wait for Jerusalem. He came to the desert. He did not require a perfect people before he would agree to be present among them. He came to the people who were there imperfect, wandering, occasionally faithless, always dependent, and he stayed. The tent was temporary. The presence was not. And centuries later, when the wilderness was long past and the promised land had become home, and a king named Solomon would finally build the permanent temple in Jerusalem, with cedar from Lebanon and stone quarried from mountains and gold beyond counting, even then, the dedication prayer would look back to this, to a tent in a desert, to the moment when God first chose to live among his people in the form of something that could be carried. Because the point was never the building. The point was always the living among. That is what the tabernacle was. That is what it remains, even now, as a story, not a relic of ancient religion, not a museum piece of Old Testament history, but a portrait of a God who wants to be close, who gives his spirit to craftsmen, who accepts the offerings of ordinary people, who fills tents with glory, who comes. If this story moved you, if somewhere in the details of the bells and the gold and the cloud you heard something you needed to hear, share it with someone. And if you wanted to follow this story forward into the temple Solomon built and the controversy it created, that video is waiting for you on the screen right now.